He hadn't spoken a word to another soul in over 3 months. Solitude had become more than a lifestyle, it was a fortress he'd built around himself, brick by careful brick. But that illusion shattered the moment 3 desperate women appeared at the edge of his land, children clutching at their skirts like fragile lifelines. The midday sun bore down with merciless heat when he first heard them. Voices, real human voices, cutting through the cocoon of silence that had blanketed his ranch for years like a second skin. Thaddeus Crow dropped the hammer mid-swing, letting it thud uselessly against the dry earth, and turned toward the sound. They were coming up the dusty road, slow-moving silhouettes distorted by heat waves. 3 women, children in tow. Their shadows stretched behind them, long and flickering like ghosts. He hadn't seen another person since spring's supply run into town. Not one. And now, strangers living, breathing, desperate, were headed straight for him. One of the little girls stumbled and fell, letting out a shrill wail that cut through the stillness like a blade. One of the women lifted her without hesitation, arms practiced and firm. Thaddeus felt a tightness bloom in his chest. Strangers meant disruption, questions, eyes that might search too deep, conversations he'd long forgotten how to begin, much less finish, without thinking. His hand brushed the worn stock of the rifle leaning against the fence post. It wasn't threat, just muscle memory. People didn't just end up here by accident. The woman leading the group had dark hair spilling from a sun-faded bonnet. Her dress, once likely a cheerful blue, had turned a weary gray from sun and dust. Despite the slump in her shoulders, she walked with intention. The others followed close, one with a swaddled bundle held tight, the other gripping the hand of a boy who looked no older than 8. As they came closer, Thaddeus saw what exhaustion looked like painted across a face, eyes sunken, expressions strained. These weren't travelers passing through, these were people fleeing something. The woman in front raised her hand in greeting. Her smile barely clung to her lips, trembling and unsure. "Sir," she called, her voice raw from dust and distance. "We don't mean trouble. We just need a word with you." He didn't move. 20 yards separated them, close enough to see every streak of dirt on their clothes, every tremble in their stance, every silent plea written in the way their children clung to them. The smallest girl had stopped crying, but her cheeks were streaked with dried tears and grime. The lead woman took another cautious step forward. "My name is Clarabelle. These are my friends, Mercy and Violet. We've been walking since dawn and—" She paused, glanced back at the children, then met his eyes again. "We need help." The words struck something old and buried inside him. That feeling he'd worked so hard to drown out, responsibility. The weight of someone else's burden, pressing down on his shoulders. This life he'd built wasn't a mistake. It was armor, designed specifically to prevent moments like this one. But as he looked at them, at the boy standing between his mother and a stranger like a little soldier, at the trembling legs of a toddler too tired to cry anymore, Thaddeus understood. Some decisions aren't made, they happen. He opened his mouth to speak, but Clarabelle quietly added, "We just need a safe place to sleep. The children can't go any farther." That's when he understood what she was truly asking. And the worst part, he was already thinking of saying yes. No one had stepped through Thaddeus Crow's front door in 15 years, but when he opened it and waved them inside, he knew he wasn't just letting in 3 weary women and a handful of children. He was inviting chaos into the fragile quiet that had kept him company all these years. The house seemed to hold its breath. The silence, once comforting, now felt like glass about to splinter. The women crossed the threshold slowly, cautiously, as if the very air might reject them. The children stuck close, wide-eyed and unsure. The boy, Mercy's son, watched Thaddeus like he was some kind of puzzle too dangerous to solve. "Sit wherever you like," Thaddeus offered, then immediately regretted it. Where exactly were they supposed to sit? The parlor had only one chair and a crude bench he'd crafted years ago and never bothered to use. Dust floated lazily in the afternoon light, seeping through windows that hadn't been opened in ages. Clarabelle settled onto the bench and pulled the youngest girl into her lap. The child curled into her without a sound, thumb drifting to her mouth as her wide eyes studied the room. Mercy stayed on her feet, one hand gently anchored to her son's shoulder. Violet held her bundle of belongings close to her chest like it might vanish if she let it go. You said you've been walking since dawn, Thaddeus said, leaning against the doorframe. Sitting felt too personal, too much like agreement. Where'd you come from? They exchanged a glance. We were staying at a boarding house about 20 miles east, Clarabelle replied. But things changed. How? This time it was Mercy who answered, jaw clenched tight around the words. The man who ran it decided we owed him more than rent. Thaddeus's stomach turned. He knew the type, men who smelled vulnerability like blood in the water. Predators hiding behind polite smiles and unlocked doors. So, you left. We had no choice. Violet whispered. A woman in town told us about your ranch. She said you lived alone. Said you kept to yourself, but you weren't the kind who'd hurt us. That truth sank heavily into the room. They'd walked 20 miles on the trust of a stranger's offhand remark, hoping gambling that Thaddeus Crow, recluse and mystery, might show them an ounce of mercy. The little girl, Clarabelle's daughter, slipped off her mother's lap and tottered toward the fireplace. She pointed at the cold ashes, her face curious. Hasn't been lit in weeks, Thaddeus muttered. Don't need it. When did you last cook a proper meal? Clarabelle asked, and something in her tone made him glance up. There was no accusation, only concern. I eat fine. I'm sure you do. But her eyes had already swept the place, taking in the empty shelves, the untouched counters. The air of stillness too thick to be healthy. The way he stood, like a man avoiding touch, like contact might scorch him. When did you last have company? The question struck harder than it should have. He remembered against his will the sound of laughter in that room, the scent of fresh bread, the warmth of voices overlapping over supper. Then he shoved those memories back into the dark where they belonged. I don't have company, he said, flat. Mercy's boy tugged at her sleeve and whispered something. Samuel wants to know if you have any food. She translated. They haven't eaten since yesterday morning. Yesterday morning. Something gave inside Thaddeus, something old and brittle. These women had walked more than a day with starving children on nothing but rumor and desperation. And they'd come here, to him. I'll make something, he said, already turning toward the kitchen. You all just make yourselves at home. But as he reached for the cupboard door, he knew this was no longer his home alone. Thaddeus had just reached the pantry door when Clarabelle's voice halted him. Mr. Crow, she said, her tone heavier now. There's something else you need to know. Something about why we had to leave in such a hurry. He turned slowly, already, sensing that whatever came next would only deepen the storm now circling his quiet life. The three women stood close together in the fading light of his dusty parlor, their children leaning into them with wide, anxious eyes. And in that moment, Thaddeus understood with grim clarity he hadn't been living in solitude to keep people out. He'd been shielding the wounded part of himself from ever being torn open again. But these women, these children, they were about to test everything he thought he'd buried. Sometimes the thing you run from doesn't just catch up. Sometimes it knocks on your door wearing desperation and holding the hand of a child. Clarabelle's next words struck him like a blow to the gut. But it wasn't her past that shattered the quiet he'd built like a fortress. It was what she said about his own, the boarding house owner. She began, her voice level but her hands trembling. He wasn't just asking for back rent. He said he knew men who'd pay well for women like us, mothers with nowhere to turn. He gave us until sunrise to make up our minds. Thaddeus felt it then, that hot, coiling anger rising in his chest, the same rage that had driven him from civilization all those years ago. Men who preyed on the weak, who looked at suffering and saw opportunity. He'd seen them before. He knew what they were, his fists clenched, knuckles pale, but he forced himself to loosen them. He couldn't afford to lose control. Not now. Mercy's voice followed softly, barely audible. That's not all. He sent someone after us, a man on horseback passed us in our back, headed toward town. We hid in the brush, but he was knocking on doors, asking about 3 women with children. A heavy stillness settled over the room. This wasn't just a matter of offering a meal and a place to rest. These women were on the run, hunted. And now, by opening his door, Thaddeus had stepped into the fire with them. But then Clarabelle added something that made the air seem thinner. The woman who told us about you, she said slowly, She said your name was Thaddeus Crow, that you'd lost your own family years ago. That's why you lived out here. She said you'd know what it means to protect children. Silence swallowed the room whole. Even the children were still, sensing something had shifted in the air. Thaddeus felt his composure buckling under the weight of memory. The laughter of Sarah, Emma's voice calling across the yard, the fever that had taken them both into cruel days while he'd been away, thinking he had time. She had no right to tell you that, he said, voice low and rough with old grief. Maybe not, Clarabelle said gently. But she wasn't wrong, was she? He turned away, staring through the window at the land he'd clung to like a penance. Loneliness had been his refuge, his punishment, a life lived small and safe, where nothing could be taken from him again. But now, these strangers were asking him to open that door again, to care, to risk, to feel. A little girl toddled toward a shelf thick with dust. Violet's daughter, barely old enough to speak. She reached up to touch a small wooden horse, Emma's horse, the one Thaddeus had carved for her 4th birthday. Just before the world fell apart, her tiny fingers brushed it gently, reverently. Can I play with this? She asked, looking up at him with eyes that twisted the knife already buried in his chest. Thaddeus stared at the toy, frozen in place. Behind him, he could feel the women holding their breath, waiting to see if he could give even the small piece of himself to them. Then came the sound that broke everything. Hoof beats, fast, hard, coming straight for them. Mercy moved quickly to the window. Her face went pale. Someone's coming, she whispered. They're riding hard up the main road. Thaddeus felt the cold settle into his bones. The choice he'd been wrestling with was gone. The danger wasn't knocking anymore, it was charging down his path. And it wasn't alone. He looked through the window and saw 2 riders dismounting at his gate. One was unfamiliar, lean, sharp-featured, eyes like broken glass that saw suffering as currency. The other man made Thaddeus's blood run cold. Sheriff Marcus Cale, thicker now, older, with graying hair and that badge catching the dying light, but still recognizable. Still the same man who had stood in this room 15 years ago and told Thaddeus nothing could be done about the doctor who'd turned away a sick child. The same man who had taken bribes while people like Thaddeus watched their families die. Thaddeus moved with quiet purpose. He took the rifle from beside the door and stepped out onto the porch. He didn't raise it, but he didn't need to. The message was clear. This was his land, and he would defend it. Thaddeus Crow, Cale called out, feigning warmth. Been a long time. Not long enough. Thaddeus replied evenly. State your business. The lean man stepped forward, oozing confidence. Name's Garrett. I'm looking for 3 women who ran off with something that doesn't belong to them. We tracked them this way. Haven't seen anyone, Thaddeus said, voice like stone. Garrett smiled, taking another step closer. That's so funny, because we followed their tracks right up to your gate. And then, poof, like they vanished. Thaddeus didn't move, didn't blink. But inside, he was already choosing sides. Because the women weren't the only ones being hunted today. So was the man he used to be. Asterisk asterisk. Inside the house, hushed whispers floated through the air as the women struggled to keep the children silent. A floorboard groaned. Then came the soft, sudden cry of Violet's daughter, stifled quickly. But in the heavy tension blanketing the house, the sound rang out like a gunshot. Sheriff Cale's lips curled into a smirk. Cold and deliberate. Sounds like you've got company, Thaddeus. Mind if we come in and say hello? I mind plenty. This is private land, Thaddeus answered, rifle still in hand. Now, Cale said, resting a hand lazily on his holstered weapon. We're just looking for some stolen property. 3 women walked out of Mr. Garrett's place with something that wasn't theirs. Just want to have a little chat. Thaddeus felt a heat rise in his chest, anger, righteous and unrelenting. Property. They were calling the women property, like they were livestock. And here was Cale again, playing henchman to monsters, just as he had 15 years ago when justice was bought and buried in envelopes of cash. Thaddeus took a step forward, lifting the barrel of his rifle a few inches. The only conversation I want, he said slowly, is the one where you explain why you're trespassing on my land. Garrett's mask slipped then, For just a second, the calm businessman vanished, and in his place stood something vicious, primal. "Those women belong to me," he spat. "They've got debts, contracts. I'm not leaving without what's mine." "The hell you're not." The two men stared at him. Thaddeus saw at the mental math, 2 against 1, but they hadn't expected resistance, and certainly not from a man they thought had rotted into a shadow. He had the porch, he had cover, and more than anything, he had a reason that neither of them could understand, a reason deeper than money, older than revenge. From inside came a small voice. A boy's voice. "Mama, is the bad man gonna find us, Samuel?" Afraid. And that fear struck Thaddeus like a nail driven through his chest. He thought of Emma, thought of her clinging to him during those final, fevered nights. How helpless he'd felt, how useless, as the world decided her life wasn't worth saving. Cale moved closer. "Don't do this, Thaddeus. These women dangerous. Thieves, they've probably already cleared your cupboards." Thaddeus didn't blink. "The only thieves I see," he said quietly, "are standing in my yard." Garrett's hand twitched toward his sidearm, and in that instant, Thaddeus knew that nothing in his 15 years of self-imposed exile had prepared him for this. Some battles, once begun, only ended in blood. He fired. The first shot shattered more than just the silence. It broke the walls of solitude he'd built around his grief. Garrett barely had time to react. The bullet tore through a fence post inches from his skull, sending him scrambling behind his horse. Cale fumbled with his weapon, startled. He hadn't expected a fight. He remembered Thaddeus as a broken man, a recluse. He wasn't ready for a warrior. "The next one won't miss," Thaddeus called out, racking the bolt with calm precision. "Get off my land." From the house came muffled sobs, little cries, barely stifled by their mother's hands. Every sound was a blade against his ribs. But this time, he could do something. He would. "You're making a mistake, Crow." Cale shouted from behind his horse. "Those women are criminals. If you hide them, that makes you one too." Thaddeus didn't flinch. "Then come put me in chains," he replied. "I'll be waiting." The challenge burned through the air. Cale had the badge, the law, but Thaddeus had a rifle, and nothing left to lose. Garrett rose from his crouch, pistol gripped tight. "I'll give you $50 a head for those women. That's more money than you've seen in a decade. Walk away, Crow. That's all you have to do." Thaddeus turned his rifle toward him. "Here's my offer," he said flatly. "You get on your horse and ride out, or I send you home with a hole big enough to fit a wagon through." Behind him, Clarabelle's voice murmured gently to the children. Her tone pulled him back in time. Sarah's voice during the storms, her lullabies. To Emma, his heart twisted. These weren't fugitives. These were mothers, survivors, and they were trusting him to be the protector he hadn't been able to be back then. Cale tried again, this time with a practiced, persuasive tone. "You don't know what you're doing. They've filled your head with lies. They ran off with what wasn't theirs." The word dead hit like a slap, not because it was true but because it revealed so much. How little Cale thought of them, just like back then, just like Sarah and Emma, just inconvenient lives, disposable and forgettable. Not people, just property. Thaddeus's voice was low but sharp as shattered glass. "You've got 10 seconds, Sheriff. Leave on your horse or over it." And then Clarabelle stepped outside. The door creaked open. She moved past him, slow but steady. Her hands were empty, held up where they could see, but her chin was lifted, eyes blazing with quiet fury. "Mr. Garrett," she said, her voice ringing across the yard, "if you want to speak to us, then speak. But you leave this man out of it." Thaddeus's heart leapt into his throat. "Get back inside," he pleaded, but she shook her head. No more running, no more hiding. She looked down at him, not afraid, not uncertain. Her gaze held something he hadn't seen in years. Not pity, not fear, something braver. Hope, asterisk, asterisk. 15 years. That's how long Thaddeus Crow had lived with the silence, some days heavy, some days hollow. He thought he'd buried his reasons deep enough that they'd never claw their way back out. But now, with the sun hanging low over his ranch and guns trained on the women beside him, everything he'd run from stood clawing at his front porch. Clarabelle's eyes didn't waver. Neither did her voice. "We didn't steal anything from you, Mr. Garrett," she said, not flinching, even as a half-dozen rifles gleamed in the light. "Unless you count our dignity, our choices, our right to say no." Garrett's chuckle oozed contempt. "You signed contracts, all three of you, room, board, and services in exchange for your debt being cleared. Legal, binding, contracts. Signed under threat don't mean a damn thing." Thaddeus shot back, keeping his aim steady. Any decent judge would throw them out. Sheriff Cale's smirk was venomous. "Good thing Judge Morrison ain't what you'd call decent. A little debt forgiveness makes a man awfully flexible in the courtroom." The casual way he admitted it, like it was just part of the weather, landed like a sucker punch to Thaddeus's gut. The same filthy system that had crushed his family was still grinding good people under its heel, but this time he wasn't going to just watch. Behind him, the door creaked again. Clarabelle didn't stand alone anymore. Mercy stepped out, Violet right behind her. None of them carried weapons. They didn't need to. Their courage was naked and raw. They weren't hiding, weren't cowering. They stood side by side on the worn-out porch of a man who'd sworn off the world, daring it to test their resolve. "You want us?" Mercy's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. Her arm circled her young son, who'd followed her out despite her whispered pleas to stay hidden. "Then tell these children why their mothers are nothing more than property in your eyes." Samuel, barely 8, took a shaky step forward. His fists were balled tight, but his voice was loud enough to still the wind. "My mom is not for sale. She's not anyone's property." The words hit like thunder. Even Cale blinked, something unspoken flickering behind his eyes. Not guilt, but maybe a recognition, a dim awareness that some stains never wash out. Garrett, though he was unmoved, "Kid doesn't know how the world works," he said with a shrug. "Debts get paid, one way or another. These women owe me 6 months of labor, and I intend to collect." Thaddeus didn't lower his gun. "The only thing getting collected today is you and your lapdog sheriff. You've got 30 seconds to get off my land." Cale scoffed. "You're outnumbered, Crow. 2 guns against 1. Bad odds for a man with so much to lose." That's when Thaddeus smiled, an honest, almost forgotten expression that cracked across his face like sunrise. "You made the same mistake all those years ago, thinking I care more about staying alive than about doing what's right." His rifle shifted, the barrel leveling squarely at Cale's chest. "Far as I'm concerned, the world's a better place with one less corrupt bastard in it, and I've got nothing left to lose proving it." The air snapped taut. 1 heartbeat, 2, 3. Guns raised, words spent. Justice and damnation balancing on a trigger's breath. But something had changed. Thaddeus wasn't that broken man who'd hidden in the hills anymore. These women, these warriors with no armor, but their pain had reminded him who he used to be, and who he still could become. Then came the sound that turned blood to ice. HOOFBEATS. Fast, heavy, more than just a couple riders. Garrett's face lit up with vile satisfaction. Cale straightened like a man who thought the world had tilted back in his favor. Reinforcements. Maybe the cavalry he'd counted on. But Thaddeus saw the truth first. He knew those riders, and they weren't here for Garrett. And they sure as hell weren't here to de-escalate anything. The dust cloud rolled closer, revealing 5 men on horseback, weather-worn faces, long guns strapped to their saddles. Their leader, Wade McKinley, was a rancher Thaddeus knew from town. A man not easily stirred, and definitely not the sort who came just to watch. But that's exactly what they were, witnesses. Not lawmen, not hired guns. Something far more dangerous, the eyes of the world, arriving at the exact moment when truth could no longer hide behind curtains or cowards, and what they would see here today would echo beyond the ranch, into courtrooms and corridors and memory. Thaddeus didn't flinch. The women didn't step back. And somewhere deep in the marrow of his bones, he knew whatever happened next, this was a fight worth having, even if it cost him everything. ***. Wade McKinley commanded respect across the territory. He wasn't just a rancher, he was a man whose word held weight, whose presence settled disputes before they began. He dismounted slowly, with deliberate calm, as 4 of his ranch hands armed. An alert surveyed the tense scene with the unblinking eyes of men who'd seen enough to know danger. When it showed itself, well, McKinley said, his voice cutting through the still air. "Sheriff Cale, what brings the law sniffing around Thaddeus Crow's place?" Cale lowered his gun. "Just slightly calculating, unsure now. Official business," he said. "Those women are fugitives." McKinley glanced toward the porch, where the women stood, arms around their children, defiant despite the fear in their eyes. "Funny," he said, folding his arms. "They look like mothers protecting their young to me." His gaze shifted to the suited man beside Cale. "And you are Garrett. I represent the Riverside boarding house. These women violated their contracts and fled with stolen property." McKinley's face darkened. "Riverside," he echoed. "That's the place the preachers have been whispering about in town. The one where women disappear and no one asks questions." He turned back to Cale, his expression full of quiet disgust. "You're helping him." Cale hesitated. The name Wade McKinley carried weight, and more than that, it carried truth, integrity, honesty. Having him here changed the game. "The law is the law," Cale muttered weakly. "Whose law?" McKinley snapped. "The kind that shields women and children, or the kind that sells them like cattle?" Thaddeus felt something stir inside him. For the first time in 15 years, he wasn't standing alone. But then Garrett drew a second pistol, this one aimed directly at Samuel. "Enough talk," he growled. "They come with me now or the boy dies." Time stilled. Samuel froze, pale and silent. Mercy started forward, but stopped cold when Garrett turned the barrel her way. "One more step and I'll paint this porch in his blood." McKinley's men shifted, hands hovering near their holsters, but Garrett knew exactly what he was doing. 7 guns against one man, he sneered. "I like my odds when I've got insurance." That's when it hit Thaddeus, the brutal truth of what it meant to protect. It wasn't just about risking your life. It was about watching the innocent suffer for your choices. He'd lived that once. As Emma slipped through his hands, fever stealing the light from her eyes, now that same helplessness came roaring back. But Clarabelle moved. She stepped forward slowly, placing herself between Garrett's pistol and the boy. Her voice was steady. "Take me. Leave the children. I'll go willingly if you promise they stay here safe. All 3 of you," Garrett snapped, "or the boy dies." Mercy joined Clarabelle without hesitation. "Then we all go. But the children stay." Violet stepped forward too, her jaw set. 3 mothers, forming a shield of flesh and bone between danger and their young. Women who had already lost everything and now stood ready to give even more. Something inside Thaddeus cracked open. This was courage, not bluster or violence. This was love in its rawest form, putting someone else's life above your own. But then, he realized something else. Maybe the greatest honor he could give to the dead was to stop letting others die in their name. He looked down at the rifle in his hands. Suddenly, it didn't feel heavy anymore. What happened next took only seconds. "No," Thaddeus said quietly, stepping off the porch, voice clear. "Nobody's going anywhere." Garrett swung the pistol toward him. "Back off, old man, or I'll..." The crack of a rifle exploded across the ranch like thunder. But it wasn't Thaddeus who fired. Smoke curled from Wade McKinley's weapon. Garrett hit the dirt with a cry of pain, clutching his shoulder as his gun flew from his hand. He writhed in agony but lived. "Threatening children," McKinley said grimly, working the bolt on his rifle. "That crosses every line there is." Sheriff Cale's hand twitched toward his gun but froze. McKinley's ranch hands had already drawn, and the look in their eyes made it clear. One wrong move, and the sheriff would be tasting dirt. McKinley's voice rang with unshakable authority. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to pick up that wounded piece of filth, put him on his horse, and ride back to whatever sewer you came from. And Sheriff Cale, if I ever hear the name Riverside again, I'll make sure every church, every town hall, every mother in this territory knows the kind of law you've been enforcing." Cale glanced around, at the ranch hands, at Thaddeus, at the women and children watching in silence. He was outgunned, outnumbered, and worst of all, morally exposed. Without a word, he helped Garrett onto his horse. Garrett's face twisted with rage. "This isn't over," he hissed. "Oh, it is," Thaddeus said flatly. "And if I see either of you on my land again, McKinley won't have the chance to fire first." The 2 men rode away. Garrett slumped over his saddle, Cale's pride trailing behind them like dust in the wind. Then silence fell. Not the hollow silence of loneliness, but the deep, full hush of peace finally earned. Clarabelle stepped forward, gathering her daughter into her arms. The child had never let go of Emma's little wooden horse. She looked up at Thaddeus with wide eyes. "Can I keep this?" she asked softly, lifting the toy. Thaddeus swallowed hard. "It belongs here," he said. "Just like you do, if you want to stay." The women exchanged glances, hope flickering like sunrise through storm clouds. "You mean that?" Mercy asked. Thaddeus nodded. "This place has been too quiet for too long. It could use the sound of kids running again." Laughter in the air. McKinley clapped a hand on Thaddeus's shoulder. "Good man. Your Sarah and Emma would be proud." As McKinley and his men rode out, Thaddeus stood watching the children race around the fence posts, joy spilling from their mouths like music. Their mothers sat on the porch, heads close in quiet conversation. The sun dipped low, casting the yard in warm, golden light, and for the first time in years, Thaddeus didn't fear the dark. Clarabelle approached, her daughter still clutching the wooden horse. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Thaddeus looked at her, then at the scene around him, life where once there had been only ghosts. "Thank you," he replied, "for reminding me some things are still worth fighting for." That night, as lamplight spilled from windows long dimmed and children's laughter rang through rooms that had forgotten joy, Thaddeus Crow finally understood. The greatest kind of courage isn't in standing alone. It's in opening your heart again even when it might break, in choosing to protect, in letting others stand with you. The women stayed, built lives. Clarabelle became the school teacher. Mercy opened a small bakery. Violet tended a garden that flourished behind the house. And Thaddeus, he learned that the man he thought had died with his family had only been sleeping, waiting for a reason to live again.